In 1951, a German Jewish philosopher published a book that described Twitter mobs with more precision than any Silicon Valley engineer ever has. She identified the psychology of pile-ons, the architecture of cancellation, and the way ordinary people become cruel in groups online, and she did all of it decades before the internet existed. Her name was Hannah Arendt, and she wasn't writing about technology at all. She was writing about totalitarianism, and her framework doesn't just explain pile-ons, it predicts exactly when they'll escalate and who's most vulnerable. What's strange is that we have entire teams at Meta and X, where Elon Musk gutted the trust and safety division in 2023, and at TikTok too. Thousands of engineers, behavioral psychologists, policy specialists, all trying to understand why people form digital mobs and why pile-ons escalate the way they do. Even after Frances Haugen leaked internal research showing Meta knew its own algorithms amplified outrage, the solution stayed technical. Tweak the algorithm, adjust the ranking signal, add a friction screen before retweeting. The best explanation most of them still offer comes down to virality, or algorithmic amplification, which is like saying a forest fire happens because of oxygen. Technically true, but completely useless for understanding why it starts, how it spreads, and what it actually destroys. Arendt had better answers. She laid them out in 1951 with The Origins of Totalitarianism, refined them in 1963 with Eichmann in Jerusalem, and sharpened them further in The Human Condition and her 1,967 essay Truth and Politics in The New Yorker. But to understand why her ideas map so precisely onto your timeline, you need to understand what she was actually looking at. And it wasn't just Hitler and Stalin. It was something structural about what happens when thinking stops and belonging takes over. Hannah Arendt fell in love with her philosophy professor, Martin Heidegger, one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, and then watched him join the Nazi Party. If you want to understand why she became obsessed with how intelligent people stop thinking, that relationship is the place to start. She'd studied under Heidegger at the University of Marburg, then moved to Heidelberg to work with Karl Jaspers, where she wrote her dissertation on the concept of love in St. Augustine. She was a serious, rigorous thinker, trained in the phenomenological tradition, and then the person she'd been intellectually and romantically closest to aligned himself with fascism. Not because he lacked intelligence, because he stopped thinking critically about what he was joining. That experience of watching brilliance collapse into complicity became the engine behind everything Arendt wrote afterward. The Gestapo briefly arrested her in 1933, and she fled to Paris, where she spent years as a stateless refugee before making it to New York in 1941. American citizenship came in 1951, the same year she published the book that would define her career. The Origins of Totalitarianism wasn't just a history of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. It was an anatomy, a dissection of how mass movements form, how they consume individual judgment, and how they make atrocity feel not just acceptable, but normal. Before Arendt, the dominant framework for understanding crowds belonged to Gustave Le Bon, whose 1,895 book, The Crowd, argued that individuals in a mob undergo a kind of hypnosis, where they lose their rational faculties and become suggestible, primitive, governed by emotion. It's a dramatic theory, and it's also wrong in a way that matters. Le Bon treated the crowd as an aberration, a pathological state that overtakes otherwise rational people. Arendt saw something far more unsettling. She argued the problem wasn't that the crowd made people irrational, but that people arrived already primed for it. The crowd was the symptom. The disease was what had happened to them before they ever showed up. She identified 4 specific mechanisms, and these are the ones that matter for us. The first was what she called the atomization of individuals. In the decades before totalitarian movements took hold in Europe, Arendt observed that traditional social structures like community associations, trade unions, churches, and political parties with actual ideological commitments had broken down. People weren't connected to each other through stable, meaningful institutions anymore. And loneliness, Arendt argued, wasn't just an emotional state, it was a political condition. She drew a sharp distinction between solitude and loneliness that changes how you think about both. Solitude means being alone with yourself and still being able to think, to carry on the internal dialogue that constitutes moral reasoning. Loneliness means being unable to do that, being so disconnected from stable relationships that you lose the ability to check your thoughts against reality. A lonely person doesn't trust their own judgment because they have no one to test it against, and that desperation for belonging made atomized individuals susceptible to movements that offered identity through membership rather than through thought. The second mechanism concerned the mob itself, and this is where Arendt broke from Le Bon most sharply. She drew a careful distinction between a mob and a people. A people has shared interests, deliberates, disagrees internally, and arrives at positions through reasoning. This is close to what Jürgen Habermas, Arendt's contemporary and intellectual counterpart in Frankfurt, would later formalize as the public sphere, a space where citizens engage in rational and critical debate. A mob is the public sphere's opposite. A mob is united not by shared ideas but by shared emotion, usually resentment, outrage, or the thrill of collective power. And the critical thing Arendt noticed was that mob members don't actually need to believe the content of what they're saying. They need to perform belief, because the performance of certainty is what grants membership. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Her third mechanism came later, when she covered the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem for The New Yorker in 1961. Eichmann, who had organized the logistics of the Holocaust, turned out not to be a monster. He was a bureaucrat who hadn't thought deeply about what he was doing. Arendt described it as an inability to think, meaning not a lack of intelligence but a refusal to engage in the internal dialogue that constitutes genuine moral reasoning. Clichés replaced thought. The rules of his social context replaced judgment. He did what everyone around him was doing. And that, Arendt argued, was far more terrifying than sadism, because it meant evil didn't require evil people. It only required the absence of thinking. She called it the banality of evil, and the phrase became one of the most debated concepts in 20th century philosophy. The fourth mechanism targeted truth itself. In Truth and Politics, Arendt argued that the most dangerous form of dishonesty in political life wasn't ordinary lying, but what she called organized lying, the systematic replacement of factual reality with a constructed narrative so total that individuals could no longer distinguish between fact and fiction. The tool of organized lying wasn't just propaganda, it was the destruction of the common world, meaning the shared set of facts that allows people to disagree in ways that actually mean something. Without a common world, debate disappears, and all that's left is competing performances of certainty. So here are four mechanisms: atomization, mob formation, the banality of thoughtlessness, and the destruction of the common world. And here's what nobody in Trust and Safety at any major platform seems to have fully reckoned with. These aren't just descriptions of 20th century totalitarianism. They are the exact operating system of social media pile-ons, and the parallel isn't a metaphor, it's structural. In Arendt's framework, atomization creates the precondition, and on social media, that precondition looks like an isolated individual scrolling alone at 2 in the morning, disconnected from any stable community and hungry for belonging. In Arendt's framework, the mob forms around shared emotion rather than shared thought. And on Twitter, that looks like a pile-on forming around a screenshot, united by outrage, where nobody is deliberating about whether the target did something wrong because they're too busy performing their alignment with the group. In her framework, the banality of evil means ordinary people do terrible things because they've stopped thinking. And on social media, that looks like the person who adds the 400th quote tweet without once asking whether the target deserves it, whether the context is complete, whether they'd say this to someone's face. They're not thinking, they're participating. And in Arendt's framework, the destruction of the common world means there's no shared factual basis for disagreement, which on social media looks like a single tweet getting stripped from its context, reframed with a new narrative, and circulated until the original meaning becomes irrecoverable. Arendt was watching rallies in Nuremberg while we're watching threads on X, but the human dynamics underneath haven't changed at all. The people building platform policy treat this as a technology problem, a Section 230 problem, a content moderation problem. Arendt would call it a thinking problem, and that distinction changes everything about how you respond. Let me show you how each of her principles plays out in practice, and what it means for anyone trying to survive digital public life with their integrity intact. Start with atomization as a political condition. The average person on Twitter or TikTok isn't embedded in a stable intellectual community with norms of deliberation. They're scrolling alone, and their social feedback arrives in the form of likes and retweets, which are metrics that reward speed and emotional intensity rather than careful thought. When a pile-on starts, the atomized individual doesn't have a trusted community, telling them to wait And think about this. They have a feed full of strangers performing certainty, and joining the pile-on offers something the lonely person desperately needs, which is instant belonging. You quote tweet the target, you get likes from people you admire, and for a moment you feel like part of something. Arendt would recognize this immediately because it's the same mechanism that filled rally grounds in the 1930s. Not ideology, but the narcotic of collective belonging for people who had nothing else. Consider what happened to Justine Sacco in 2013. She tweeted a poorly worded joke to her 170 followers before boarding a flight to South Africa, and by the time she landed, she was the #1 trending topic worldwide. Tens of thousands of strangers had united to destroy her career. John Ronson documented the aftermath in So You've Been Publicly Shamed and found something Arendt would have predicted, which was that most of the people participating couldn't clearly articulate what Sacco had done wrong. They weren't deliberating, they were belonging. Ronson also discovered that the person whose tweet about Sacco generated the most engagement had fewer followers than she did before the incident. The pile-on made him famous, which meant the mob didn't just consume its target, it compensated its members. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist at NYU, has mapped a version of this from the opposite direction. In The Righteous Mind, he argues that moral judgment is driven primarily by intuition, by fast, emotional, identity-based responses, and that reasoning only shows up afterward to justify what we already feel. Arendt would agree with the diagnosis, but not the prescription. Haidt treats this as human nature, something to design around. Arendt treated it as a failure condition, something that happens when the structures supporting thought have collapsed. That distinction matters enormously, because if it's nature, you build guardrails. If it's a failure condition, you can repair it. For anyone building a brand, running a company, or existing on social media with opinions, the operational takeaway is this: the mob doesn't form because people disagree with you. It forms because lonely people need something to belong to, and outrage is the cheapest community available. De-escalation doesn't come from explaining yourself more clearly, because the mob isn't processing your content. They're using your content as a membership ritual. The second principle cuts deeper. Arendt's concept of thoughtlessness, which she identified in Eichmann and later expanded in The Life of the Mind, the book she was working on when she died in 1975, is the engine that keeps pile-ons running. Thoughtlessness doesn't mean stupidity, and Eichmann was not a stupid man. He spoke fluently in the cliches of his environment, could recite every justification, and could perform the role perfectly. What he couldn't do was stop and think from someone else's perspective. He couldn't carry on the internal two-person dialogue that Arendt, borrowing from Socrates, called the two-in-one, where you interrogate your own positions as if you were your own interlocutor. On social media, thoughtlessness operates as the default mode. Platform architecture rewards speed, character limits, compress nuance into slogans, and the dopamine hit from engagement arrives before reflection can kick in. The social incentive structure actively punishes thinking out loud, because if you say something like, "I see the outrage, but I'm not sure it's that simple," you don't get rewarded for nuance. You get accused of enabling harm. The two-in-one dialogue that Arendt considered essential to moral life is structurally disincentivized by platform design itself. The Emmanuel Cafferty case from 2020 shows this with brutal clarity. A San Diego gas and electric worker was photographed with his hand in a position that someone claimed resembled a white supremacist gesture, and he explained that he'd been cracking his knuckles. None of that mattered. The image circulated, the mob formed, and Cafferty lost his job. Thousands of people participated in ending this man's livelihood, and virtually none of them stopped to consider whether a Latino truck driver from San Diego was likely flashing white supremacist signs on his route. 5 seconds of actual thinking would have killed the mob, but platforms aren't optimized for thinking, they're optimized for reaction velocity. And here's what Arendt understood about this, that content moderation teams still haven't fully grasped. You cannot reason with a mob operating in thoughtless mode. Apologies fail because the mob isn't processing your words as communication. Your apology becomes raw material for the next round of content, your clarification becomes a screenshot, and your nuance becomes evidence of evasion. The only defense, in Arendt's terms, is to refuse to participate in the thoughtlessness yourself, which sometimes means silence, and sometimes means speaking past the mob to the people outside it who are still capable of the two-in-one. René de Resta, who studied information cascades at the Stanford Internet Observatory, has documented this exact dynamic in disinformation campaigns. The target audience isn't the mob itself, it's the bystanders. Arendt understood this 70 years before De Resta's research confirmed it. The third principle is the one that should genuinely unsettle you, because it concerns the destruction of something we don't have a replacement for. In Truth and Politics, Arendt argued that factual truth is fragile. It isn't self-evident. It depends on testimony, on institutions that verify and preserve it, and on a shared commitment to distinguishing what happened from what we wish had happened. She warned that organized lying doesn't just produce false beliefs, it destroys the capacity to believe anything at all. When contradictory narratives flood every channel, when every fact becomes contested, when doing your own research means choosing the narrative that fits your tribal identity, the common world dissolves. Habermas would call this the collapse of the public sphere. Arendt would call it something worse, which is the precondition for totalitarianism. This describes your timeline right now. The common world, meaning a shared set of facts about what someone actually said, what they actually meant, and what actually happened, becomes the first casualty of every pile-on. And the mechanics of that destruction deserve close attention because they operate like a game of telephone engineered for maximum distortion. Someone tweets a sentence, and it gets quote tweeted with an interpretation that subtly shifts the meaning. That quote tweet gets screenshotted and posted to Instagram with a different caption. That screenshot gets reposted to TikTok with a voiceover adding another layer of outrage. By the fourth iteration, the original sentence is irrecoverable because each platform acts as a translation layer, and each translation optimizes for emotional intensity over accuracy. The common world disappears, replaced by a story that serves the mob's emotional needs. Arendt also understood something about public action that maps directly onto the digital age. In The Human Condition, she argued that action in the public realm carries two defining features. It is irreversible and it is unpredictable. Once you act publicly, you cannot take it back, and you cannot control how others will interpret or respond. She was writing about political action in the Greek polis, but she could have been writing about tweeting. Every statement on a public platform is irrevocable because screenshots last forever, and the consequences remain unpredictable. Sacco tweeted a joke to 170 followers and did not consent to becoming the main character of the internet for a day, but public action, as Arendt understood it, doesn't require your consent to produce consequences. It only requires witnesses. The Yale Halloween costume controversy in 2015 demonstrates common world destruction at full scale. Erica Christakis, a lecturer at Yale's Silliman College, sent a thoughtful email suggesting students could handle their own costume decisions without institutional guidance. What circulated, though, was not the email. What circulated was a narrative about a Yale professor defending racist costumes, and the common world, meaning what Christakis actually wrote, was replaced by an emotionally useful fiction. She and her husband Nicholas Christakis eventually resigned their residential roles. The mob succeeded not because it was right, but because the common world had been destroyed, and in its absence, the loudest narrative won. That destruction happened faster than anyone could rebuild, and that's the asymmetry Arendt would want you to understand. Your clarification tweet will not outrun the screenshot, and your thread explaining context will not generate the same engagement as the original outrage. The asymmetry is structural, not accidental. Cambridge Analytica demonstrated this at industrial scale during the 2016 election, not by creating new beliefs, but by flooding the information environment until the shared factual world fractured into tribal narratives. The technique is the same whether it comes from a state propaganda ministry or a coordinated pile-on, and only the speed differs. What took Arendt's totalitarian regimes years to accomplish, social media accomplishes in an afternoon. For anyone who communicates publicly, whether as a creator, a founder, or a public figure of any kind, Arendt's insight here is the most operationally useful idea in this entire analysis. Your real defense isn't reactive, it's preemptive. You build a thick, consistent, good-faith public record so that when the mob comes, and in a long enough career it will, the people who matter already have enough context to resist the narrative replacement. You're not building walls against the mob, you're building a common world that's harder to destroy. What Arendt figured out in the wreckage of mid-20th century Europe, and what platform designers and trust and safety teams and digital communicators are still struggling to absorb, is that the problem isn't the technology. Technology is the accelerant. The problem is what happens when human beings stop thinking and start belonging. Atomization, thoughtlessness, and the destruction of factual common ground aren't three separate problems. They're three phases of the same process. People lose their stable communities and become desperate for belonging. They find that belonging in mobs that reward emotional performance over thought. And then the mob destroys the shared factual world that would allow anyone to pump the brakes. Arendt watched this process unfold over decades with newspapers and radios and rally grounds. We watch it unfold in 45 minutes on a trending topic, and the mechanism is identical, even though the clock speed has changed by orders of magnitude. The insight that I think Arendt would most urgently want you to carry away from all of this concerns the antidote, which is the same for all three phases. Thinking, not intelligence, not information, not better algorithms or smarter content moderation, or stricter rules under Section 230. Thinking means the deliberate, uncomfortable practice of the two-in-one, of stopping before you retweet and asking yourself whether you actually know what happened, whether you've considered the other person's perspective, and whether you're acting out of judgment or out of a hunger to belong. And this is where Arendt would push back hardest on the conventional response to online toxicity. The answer is not to log off. The touch grass prescription, the just delete your account advice, the retreat into private life, all of it amounts to what Arendt would call atomization completing its work. The mob wins twice that way, first by destroying the common world, and then by driving the thoughtful people out of public life entirely. What remains is a public sphere populated only by people who are performing rather than thinking. Arendt didn't spend her life defending the vita activa, meaning the life of public engagement, so that the people capable of thought could surrender it to the loudest voices in the room. Next time you feel the pull of a pile-on, that righteous surge, that certainty the target deserves it, that desire to add your voice, ask yourself Arendt's question. Not, is this person wrong, but am I thinking, or am I just participating? Arendt once argued that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced ideologue, but the person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. Scroll through your timeline tonight and ask yourself how many people you see who've crossed that line and whether you're closer to it than you think. Political philosophy and social media are two fields that seem completely unrelated, but the underlying structures of human behavior connect them at every level. That's what we do here. Find hidden frameworks from unexpected fields that change how you see the world you actually live in. If you want to see how game theory explains why your meetings are useless, or how evolutionary biology predicts which startups fail, subscribe. Next week, we're going somewhere you won't expect. Leave a comment and tell me the most Arendt-like moment you've witnessed online. The pile-on where you realized nobody involved was actually thinking.